Welcome back! In this lesson, we are going to be talking about contingencies. In the last lesson, we talked about some examples of misunderstanding billing rules, unethical behavior, and fraud. Misunderstanding is an unintentional act of inaccurate billing, while both unethical behavior and fraud are intentional. For this reason, we are going to focus on the contingencies that maintain these last two types of behavior during this lesson. In our journey to become certified as a BCBA, we all studied the BACB's ethics codes for behavior analysts. We are all required to earn ethics CEUs every certification cycle. I would venture to say that the vast majority of BCBAs go into the field with the intention of behaving ethically. So what happened to motivate the unethical behavior currently plaguing our field? Is it possible that the BCBAs who are engaging in these behaviors don't recognize that they are behaving unethically? Are these BCBAs lacking a personal moral code? The BACB is clear in their code of ethics about many behaviors related to ethical billing practices. The BACB has added 4 core principles to their ethics code. One of these principles is to behave with integrity. This principle states that behavior analysts fulfill responsibilities to their scientific and professional communities, to society in general, and to the communities they serve by behaving in an honest and trustworthy manner and not misrepresenting themselves, misrepresenting their work or others' work, or engaging in fraud. In addition to this core principle, there are some specific codes that relate to ethical billing practices, including Code 1.01, being truthful. This code states behavior analysts are truthful and arrange the professional environment to promote truthful behavior in others. They do not create professional situations that result in others engaging in behavior that is fraudulent or illegal or that violates the code. They also provide truthful and accurate information to all required entities. For example, the BACB, licensure board, and funders, and individuals such as clients, stakeholders, supervisees, and trainees, and they correct instances of untruthful or inaccurate submissions as soon as they become aware of them. Code 1.02, conforming with legal and professional requirements. Behavior analysts follow the law and the requirements of their professional community, for example, the BACB and licensure board. Code 1.03, accountability. Behavior analysts are accountable for their actions and professional services and follow through on work commitments. When errors occur or commitments cannot be met, behavior analysts take all appropriate actions to directly address them, first in the best interest of clients and then in the best interest of relative parties. Code 2.06, accuracy in service billing and reporting. Behavior analysts identify their services accurately and include all required information on reports, bills, invoices, requests for reimbursement, and receipts. They do not implement or bill non-behavioral services under an authorization or contract for behavioral services. If inaccuracies in reporting or billing are discovered, they inform all relevant parties, correct the inaccuracy in timely manner, and document all actions taken in this circumstance and the eventual outcomes. Code 3.11, documenting professional activity. Throughout the service relationship, behavior analysts create and maintain detailed and high-quality documentation of their professional activities to facilitate provision of services by them or by other professionals, to ensure accountability, and to meet applicable requirements. Documentation must be created and maintained in a manner that allows for timely communication and transition of services should the need arise. Code 3.12, advocating for appropriate services. Behavior analysts advocate for and educate clients and stakeholders about evidence-based assessments and behavior change intervention procedures. They also advocate for the appropriate amount and level of behavioral service provision and oversight required to meet defined clinical goals. Code 4.01, compliance with supervision requirements. Behavior analysts are knowledgeable about and comply with all applicable supervisory requirements, including those related to supervision modalities and structure. And finally, Code 4.09, Delegation of Tasks. Behavior analysts delegate tasks to their supervisees or trainees only after confirming that they can competently perform the tasks and that the delegation complies with applicable requirements. If the BACB provides these guidelines and BCBAs are required to understand and follow these guidelines, why do they not prevent fraudulent billing practices? According to Cicero, 2021, in an article titled Behavioral Ethics, Ethical Practice is More Than Memorizing Compliance Codes, knowing and understanding ethical codes and related disciplinary actions for violating the codes is not enough to prevent unethical practices. Breaches in ethical conduct occur by professionals who know the ethics codes and believe that they are behaving ethically. Fraud isn't maintained by insufficient education of the code of ethics. The author highlights that unethical behavior is maintained by antecedent and consequent contingencies, just like all other behavior. To improve unethical behavior, we must first understand it and then alter the contingencies. Cicero describes behavioral ethics as the study of why good people sometimes do bad things. This field aligns well with the behavioral principles as it considers both antecedents and consequences that support these behaviors and is valuable in understanding unethical behavior. Cicero discussed 6 factors that influence unethical behavior, including self-serving bias, incrementalism, framing, obedience to authority, conformity bias, and the in-group, out-group phenomenon, and overconfidence bias. Each of these factors provide further insight into why ethical BCBAs engage in fraud. I'm not going to dive deep into each one, but I will give you the highlights and link to the article if you're interested in learning more about these factors. Self-serving bias is the tendency to interpret information and engage in behaviors that serve their own self-interests. This could occur either consciously or unconsciously. Essentially, people tend to engage in behaviors that have led to reinforcement in the past. They will choose behaviors where reinforcement is more immediate and desired than behaviors that produce delayed reinforcement or a decreased magnitude of reinforcement. This makes sense from a behavioral perspective, so we can see how self-serving bias might influence fraud. Incrementalism is the gradual shaping of unethical behavior over time. Small acts of unethical behavior are reinforced. The person begins to see these behaviors as normal, and it becomes easier to engage in slightly more or higher levels of unethical behavior. This increased frequency and intensity become the new norm, and unethical behavior becomes habituated. Framing refers to the way a situation is described to an individual. A person who normally adheres strictly to ethical principles can be influenced to see a situation differently depending on how the situation is explained. Framing doesn't make a person more or less ethical. It changes their perception of the situation, leading them to engage in behavior that results in an unethical outcome. Framing makes different information salient and alters motivating operations by making stimuli more or less reinforcing given how information is presented. For example, you're working for a small ABA company. You have been happy with the company and respect the owner. The owner comes to you and explains that the insurance company that covers the services for one of your clients just cut their reimbursement rates. In order to make up for the loss, the owner wants you to change some of your supervision time to direct services since they also don't allow for concurrent billing during supervision. The owner explains that this will be necessary to cover the expenses for the client. Otherwise, they might need to reduce the pay for the RBT or even refer the client somewhere else for services. Even though you believe strongly that the RBT needs your support during supervision, you understand the needs of the company and agree to go along with the owner's request. If the information was not presented to you in this way, you might have held to your ethical standards for supervision, but because the owner framed the situation from the financial perspective of the company, you were influenced in a way that encouraged you to compromise your ethics. Obedience to authority is just what it sounds like. Many of us have been conditioned to respect authority and do what we are told by those in positions of authority. We receive reinforcement from a young age when we do what is asked of us. Punishment is delivered from those of authority when we fail to do what we are told. Ethical BCBAs are, by conditioning, rule followers. When someone in authority tells them to engage in unethical behavior, they may comply, even when they know what they're doing is unethical. There may be a belief that the person in authority knows and understands the rules better, or they may believe that the consequences for not complying are more serious than the consequences for complying. Conformity bias and the in-group out-group phenomenon describes events where people tend to engage in behaviors that are similar to those around them, even when they don't align with their values. I'm sure you have observed this in simple situations such as when waiting for a signal to change at a crosswalk. If someone decides to cross the street before the signal changes, others are far more likely to follow. The in-group out-group phenomenon is similar, but it takes it a step further. It states that not only do people tend to engage in behaviors of the people in their in-group, the behavior of the people in the out-group is seen as more unethical. These behaviors may be maintained by the same contingencies that are at play with obedience to authority. Behaviors that align with those in our in-group or conform with those around us are often reinforced, and those behaviors that are different often encounter punishment. The last factor discussed in the article is the overconfidence bias. This states that people often believe that they have more expertise in a specific area than they actually do. This holds true for personal ethics as well. People often think they have a stronger moral character than they actually do. This can lead to people ignoring the impact of the contingencies that actually influence unethical behavior. Fraud is one specific type of unethical behavior and what we are going to focus on for the rest of this lesson. It is not a new phenomenon and has been studied for decades in different fields in the for-profit business arenas such as finance, manufacturing, and pharmaceuticals. There is little established research in the clinical or medical fields, including in the field of ABA, but in looking at the models applied in the for-profit arenas, they appear to be relevant to many of the factors impacting our field today. In 1973, criminologist Donald R. Cressy published a model called the Fraud Triangle. This model looked at three important factors that supported fraudulent behavior that included perceived pressure, perceived opportunity, and rationalization. In 2004, Wolf and Hermanson expanded the fraud triangle into the fraud diamond by adding capability. The authors felt capability was a critical factor that maintains fraud. An individual must have the skills needed to carry out the fraud for it to occur. And in 2016, Sarunk took the model one step farther and included personal ethics, or perhaps a lack of them, as one of the contributing factors to fraud. We just discussed the behavioral principles that support ethical and unethical behavior. Personal ethics are not as black and white as we might like to assume. No matter which model you want to examine, we can see how different environmental factors impact an individual's decision to engage in fraud. Have you encountered these factors at work? Perceived need or pressure to engage in fraud may serve as a setting event or establishing operation for fraudulent behavior. I know that I have been pressured to generate more billing, limit supervision, and exaggerate symptoms. Staff who rely on their income to pay their bills might feel pressure when they have clients who cancel or when they can't get enough clients to fill their schedule. What pressures do you feel? If you've heard people saying that they exaggerate a client's symptoms so they can get the services they need because the insurance company just doesn't understand ABA and doesn't provide the needed hours, you have heard someone rationalizing their behavior. Often people are reluctant to say some of these things out loud for fear of being judged by others. Here are some more ways that a BCBA might try to rationalize fraudulent billing. Everyone else is doing it, I'm just keeping up. This rationalization minimizes the seriousness of the behavior by assuming it's widespread, making it acceptable. It's just a little padding, the insurance companies overcharge anyway. This justification minimizes the impact on the system and justifies personal gain by framing it as a response to perceived unfairness. I'm not hurting anyone, I'm just helping them get the services they need. This ignores the financial burden and potential harm caused by inaccurate billing, including limited access to services for others. It's not really fraud, I'm just rounding up the numbers. This downplays the severity of the act by minimizing the discrepancy and focusing on technicalities. And no one will find out, I'm careful and discreet. This relies on a false sense of security and ignores the possibility of audits, investigations, or unethical breaches. Opportunity abounds in the field as it can be impossible to monitor the activities of every billable staff member. Perceived opportunities to engage in fraud serve as an antecedent to fraudulent behavior. Here are some ways that you and other staff have the opportunity to engage in fraudulent billing. Padding session times by adding extra minutes to documented service durations beyond what was actually provided. Double billing for overlapping services by billing for services provided concurrently as if they were separate sessions. Backfilling documentation by retroactively adding details to service notes after the session to justify higher billing. Upgrading service codes by billing for a higher level of service than was actually provided. Unbundling services by breaking down a single service into multiple smaller ones to increase billable hours. Misrepresenting service intensity by exaggerating the complexity or difficulty of the provided services to justify higher billing. And using billing software for manipulation by utilizing features of billing software to inflate durations, create multiple entries, or manipulate codes. These are only a few examples of the opportunities that exist in the field for engaging in fraudulent billing activities. People can get creative when there is a perceived need or pressure. When Wolf and Hermanson expanded the fraud triangle to include capability, they recognized that the individual must have the skills needed to engage in the fraudulent behavior. They must have the skill to exploit the opportunity available to them in order to engage in fraud. Capability is a component of the behavior of fraud. To engage in this behavior, the individual must understand the billing system, the codes used for billing, and the oversight or lack thereof of billable events. They need the technical skills to alter the system, like the RBT did in the case that involved deactivating the GPS function on her phone. Without the skill, the RBT would not have engaged in fraud, at least not successfully. Personal ethics was the last factor added to this model. As we talked about, there are important behavioral principles that influence unethical behavior, even for people with strong ethics. Although it would be easier for someone with a weak moral code to more freely engage in fraud, some of the people who engage in fraud may otherwise have a strong sense of ethics. It's possible that someone with strong ethics succumbs to the other variables we discussed and is led to engage in fraud. What are your thoughts? Do you think weak personal ethics is a core contributing factor for fraud? I'd love to read your thoughts about them in the comments. Here's an example of a situation where an ethical BCBA might end up engaging in fraudulent billing. A BCBA who is struggling to meet minimum billable hours because there have been a lot of sessions canceled due to client illness decides to add an extra unit to the end of the next several sessions to make up for some of the time lost. She is pressured by her company to meet her minimum billable hours. She justifies her actions by telling herself that everyone does it and feels as though the insurance company couldn't possibly find such a small discrepancy. She has the opportunity to enter her altered session time when she writes her session note and has the skill to cover her tracks so no one will know. She may have strong ethics, but the other factors might override her ethics, and she can fool herself into believing that she's not doing anything wrong. When these small infractions are reinforced, the BCBA becomes more likely to engage in these types of behaviors in the future. They start to feel more comfortable and more justifiable. When all these factors are present, fraud is not only possible, but likely. If any of these factors are missing, fraud becomes less likely. If we can mitigate all these factors, we could eliminate fraud entirely. Of all the factors, the need for the revenue or pressure for billable hours trumps all the other factors. If there is no need or pressure, the opportunity is likely to be overlooked and the rationalization and capability wouldn't be needed. Of course, those with weak personal ethics may consciously choose to engage in fraud, but if we could eliminate the need and pressure for ethical BCBAs, we could go a long way toward changing the direction our field is headed in. To address this, we have to look at the source of the need and pressure. BCBAs often invest a significant amount of money in school, supervision, and other resources to achieve their certification. There are often expenses within their job that are not covered by the company they work for. BCBAs have worked hard to become certified and rightly feel as though they should be earning a salary that allows them to live comfortably without working 60 hours per week. In addition to the needs that BCBAs have, many are under an overwhelming amount of pressure to produce revenue for the company. Some of this pressure is related to the growing trend of private equity firms buying ABA companies. With the introduction of mandated insurance coverage for ABA services in the mid-2010s, ABA companies became a hot commodity and private equity firms started scooping up smaller companies. A report by the Center for Economic and Policy Research in 2023 reports that 85% of all mergers and acquisitions that occurred in the autism services field between 2017 and 2022 were completed by private equity firms. This is a level that's not seen in other industries. Some people might see this influx of interest in the field as a benefit. There's been an increase in investment in ABA services, which should benefit clients, right? Well, unfortunately, that's not necessarily what's happening. With these large private equity firms typically comes a focus on private and short-term financial gains over client care, standardization and lack of individualization, potential reduction in access to care if companies focus on areas where profit margins are higher, a competitive advantage over nonprofit and small ABA companies, and high overhead with the addition of teams of people who don't generate income. I touched on many of these factors when I talked about some of my experiences with a large ABA company. Before I move on, I want you to think about the last factor I just mentioned. Large ABA companies often have a high overhead when they add teams of people who don't generate income. When I worked for the large ABA company, they had the usual C-suite of CEO, CFO, CIO, etc., a lawyer on staff, a credentialing department, a recruiting department, a billing department, an IT department, an intake department, an operations manager for every clinic, receptionists at larger clinics, 20 plus BCBAs who provided both clinical and financial oversight, and more that I'm not thinking of. When a company needs to support this many staff, many of them with very high salaries who don't bring in revenue, it generates an incredible amount of pressure on billable staff to generate the revenue needed just to keep the doors open, let alone turn a profit that will make investors happy. Is it any wonder BCBAs are feeling the pressure to engage in fraud? This might make you feel a little like there's no hope for the field, but that's what the next lesson is all about. In the next lesson, we will talk about strategies to help reduce some of the factors that contribute to fraud so that ethical BCBAs can continue to behave ethically.